So I wanted to explore and go deeper into the recognition of the interconnectedness of all beings and all things, everywhere visible and invisible. It's usually kind of a deeper recognition and understanding when the apparent individual starts to be fully infused by the divine nature. And that's one of the, I would say, basic misunderstandings, is that it persists even with really genuine and essential shifts of identity. And then the liberation and the clarification that takes place before and after that essential shift. And for most, it goes on for quite some time. Even those amazing, you're struck by the revelation and, you woke up and that realization doesn't go back to sleep no matter what. That there is this pervasive holding on that it is an individual, a spiritual individual, that is getting it. And then actually is not getting it and actually is trying to make it happen and not make it happen and, create all sorts of reasons of why it's not completely, full and complete. And, or perhaps the opposite, which is a little more rare, but it really does exist, which is, I'm that, right? But really it's not a true recognition of oneself. It's like a arrogant ego overlay, right? You know what I'm saying? That's not quite as prevalent as I'm the poor ego that's still trying to get it, but it definitely exists. And either it's a dream that there is this separate ego getting someplace, releasing someplace, arriving, not arriving, whatever the ego structure is speaking. But what one slowly, in most cases, begins to truly understand is that the sense of the divine is what is appearing in the ego structure, starting to come from the background to the foreground, and starts to move the life into what we call more of like the seeking stage, right? And so you start to, go to different teachers, you get different books and you have different experiences. They seem to come and then they go. And there's a great, revelation when they come, and then there's a great sadness when they go, and an attempt to kind of recreate that experience, even though that moment has come and gone. And then slowly, in most cases, it's usually a gradual unfolding. The recognition is that you are that has awoke in this ego structure, and you are that is guiding and transmuting and directing this individuation of the divine itself. The divine wakes up and it wants to know itself in this individuation. So it's not separate from, but it's impossible to understand or to know for the ego to know itself and to do what it needs to do to become that. Do you hear what I'm trying to say? It's a real essential shift. I know when this took place here, where that, I was this and then I was this, is really kind of a quite dramatic appearance. The first thought that arose was, oh, the teachers and the teaching was right. The ego cannot become awake, cannot realize this. It's up and out of the ego structure And then love and the movement of liberation comes back into the body-mind structure and begins to, burn and liberate and make conscious and to make known itself. So when that really starts to dawn, then there is a ceasing of the maneuvering and manipulation and controlling and, attempting to liberate and attempting to, become free of all of the past, the conditioning of the past, of karma, and in this current incarnation. When that really starts to permeate the life, that there was no ego that was enlightened. When that really starts to permeate, then things really start to change, because that stance, in most cases, when that essential shift starts to happen, and for everyone in this room, it has happened to a certain degree, or you wouldn't be here. And for others, that essential shift is, Strider actually was describing last night, you're in a different world, and those impulses that are trying to manipulate and manage and project and make happen and not make happen, they just can't assert themselves anymore. You can watch them still come up and try to control and make happen, but there's just a certain point where it can't happen. It can't be believed. And when that really then starts to be actualized, not spiritualized, but actualized, then for some, it can be a very, very difficult realization. It's like, who am I? What's my purpose? Where am I going? What was this all about? Blah, 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 blah. Whatever is according to your ego structure. And at that point, and I've observed it through, the 20 years, that I've been teaching, and then before that, just being in sanghas, that there often is a sort of like a closing down at that particular point. You realize there really is no person that's becoming and not becoming. It's a conglomeration of, memories and absorptions and all sorts of different influences. And so often it's like, the teacher's wrong, I'm going to find a different teacher, or the teachings were, wrong, or I'm just going to live this totally ordinary life, and, I'm no longer going to play this game of getting it and losing it, and, whatever, again, according to how you're wired up. Or you'll grab a certain revelation, which is true, but then you grab the revelation rather than the constant unfolding that really never stops. If you've ever been with a teacher and they've arrived somewhere and they're trying to tell you from where they've arrived and conceptualized, and you don't see a constant unfolding and evolution, go the opposite way. The understanding that it is infinite is infinite. And the unfolding is infinite. And it never stops. It never, ever, ever, ever ends. And that's the great good news. It is not the great good news to the ego structure that wants it all to just be done. And there is a kind of a completion. I have seen that. And that completion is just what I'm speaking of, is the ego stops trying to become enlightened and trying to become in a certain stage or phase and hold it and grasp it. There is a kind of a completion, but it really has nothing to do with the eternal unfolding that never finds a place to end. I think tomorrow morning we'll go much more into that. Because many within this Sangha are either entering or in the midst of the no-self. And the no-self, of course, is when the ego structure just, it can't, it's dissolving. It's disappearing. You know, what you thought when you signed up for this was to become enlightened, and therefore all that enlightenment means to you, or you've been taught that enlightenment is. Actually, what we've signed up for is the disappearance of the ego. The jokes on the spiritual ego. None of us would have signed up if that would have been recognized. There was still something to get or something to get rid of. So one of the, I hate to put it in like a, beginning, middle, and end, but it appears to be that way in time and space. But one of the deeper, let's put it that way, recognitions is the interconnectedness. And it actually was one of the Buddha's main teachings. And of course, Jesus and other awakened beings, they express that in their own language, in their own timing, and in their own culture. But you begin to actually not be fooled anymore by your spiritual, hierarchy, or your lack, on the bottom of the barrel somewhere, or, wherever it is that you perceive yourself to be. And that this is the good camp, and this is, the ignorant camp, and this is this, and this is this. And actually, often, the more sophisticated the spiritual personality becomes, the more hierarchical. And, them and us actually starts to really, it's always there. It's just more conscious, it's more, I am this and you are that, right? But what can't help but be seen, if there's an openness and, an availability and the lack of arrogance, actually, the more one recognizes oneself as we are, the more humble. And it's not that false humble, oh shucks, you go before me and you do this, and I'm just this, and that's all gobbledygook, spiritual gobbledygook. What is recognized is the root of our existence, of our human existence, and literally all things, visible and invisible, are the same root. That's where the true humbleness actually starts to come forth. And that we are of the same substance, the creatrix that arises from the silent and comes into the creatrix, the Shakti, and begins to create all form in all places, invisible and visible. Then the sense of me and you, it can't hold itself up anymore. It just can't. And so the sense of the community, the true Sangha, starts to be realized as we can't be separate. It's impossible. It's not true. It will never happen. I don't care how divisive it seems to be right now on the planet. You just see it clearly. It can't be this. One and the other, two. It drops away. There is no they and me. And so when that starts to dawn, what comes along with that and is a very deep and actual compassion. And compassion isn't so much that I'm a good spiritual person, and so I'm going to try to be kind to other people. I mean, that is a, what is it when you practice something? There's a word, I can't seem to find it. And of course, cultivation. And so cultivation is a good thing, and at least it gets you into the right, kind of doorway, so to speak. But it isn't the same as the understanding and the actualization that because we come from the same womb, and we come and are made up of the same substance, that compassion is the natural recognition of that sameness, of that interconnectedness, of that totality. And for different individuations, it expresses differently. For some, it's just to find and live a kind of kindness in your life. Whoever you're interacting with and whoever you're being with, it isn't like one you're really nice to and others you treat like dirt. Higher or lower just dissolves. It really can't exist anymore. That doesn't mean that you become like this doormat and, you always do and become and serve no matter, what the other is projecting. I love Byron Katie, and it's one of the main kind of movements that I attempt to live from, and that is, I can say no as easily as I can say yes. Right? This doesn't work for me. And it's said with as much of an ease as, yes, I am in service of thee, right? They're equal. On this, what we're talking about, the unitive consciousness, that is impossible to be divided, is that sense of, good, bad, deserve, undeserve, a good life, a bad life, that all, it can't hold itself up here. But you can say, you can move away from violent action or violent intent. But it isn't out of, this is a reflection of my own violence and sense of separation. Because I think that's one of the things that seems to really be missing in most spiritual communities, is when you enter that I am the one, I am everything. Sorry to say. You hear what I'm saying? We watch the war now. It is recorded on the screen. We're actually, I think, probably the first time ever in history, we're actually observing a war. And it's easy to say there's someone who's at blame, and it depends which stance you take of who is causing it and who is at blame. But the actuality, it is our kinship, visibly, consciously now, that is profoundly suffering. And we're busy taking sides and deciding whose fault it is and who's right and who's wrong. I was really touched because I do watch the news. Nate says I'm addicted, and that's probably true. I watch it, 2 or 3 times a week, maybe more if I can. And I watch it as best as possible with this open heart, this open curiosity, this open witnessing and observing. And I don't care about the opinions that are said and thought and, projected. I could care less. It doesn't even enter, really. But it's the witnessing of it. And one of the things that was quite recent, I don't remember when it was, maybe a week or 2 ago, and Pope Francis called upon Europe, because Europe is like the Middle Age, right? They know about war. They've been having war with each other for thousands of years. And, you know, we're still in this country, like in the adolescent stage, you know, it doesn't have that experience and that wisdom. You know, Europe said that the last war would be the last war. And so Pope Francis was actually calling upon Europe to come together and to find a diplomatic solution. So I've kind of talked to some of my European friends, and most people never even heard it. It didn't even land. Isn't that interesting? One of the great popes maybe that we've ever had historically. So the interconnectedness begins to dawn, that those that are throwing the bombs, those that are being killed, those that are killing, those that are having their lives in their country and everything destroyed, and those that are destroying, it's all us. It's all us. And one of the great contributions that actually can be made, I mean, most of us can't go over there and try to help out, you know, maybe in our own way. We can if we're called forth, but most of us aren't probably going to go over and dig out the buildings so people have a place to live, or bring water or food so they can eat and drink. But what we can do is to understand and to be a part of the interconnectedness. Because then, you know, it's like, I don't know how to say this. Your vote counts. And what I mean by that, if you open to what you are and live from that, and then move from that in whatever way that's being asked, then we're contributing to the awakeness of the interconnected consciousness. Do you get that? Hear that? And if you insist upon, you know, holding a particular line or a particular blame or a particular opinion, or everyone's going to have opinions, it's part of the human experience, but they arise and then they fall. You know, they don't hold and then, you know, become like solid, and then you project that opinion, you know. It just arises and it has an opinion, but then it dissolves. So it's like, do you add to the collective that recognition that we are all interconnected, or do you add to that we have a separate agenda and there are those, them and us? You know, it's that old classic indigenous teaching, which wolf do you feed? And it becomes that simple. And the more that awake, and the more that realize the interconnectedness, and the more that lives from that interconnectedness, the more then, of course, that interconnectedness enters the collective. You know, I've noticed just probably in the last 5 to 10 years, but especially the last 5 years, that the awakening to the unity of consciousness is so much more available. Because now it's in the collective, the language, you know, the descriptions, the books, you know, the teachings, they're all very much into the collective, so it's lighter. And even though, you know, the shadow actually is bringing up the more extreme, because the light is more available. And so these recognitions, they're not, you know, they're mostly, we can see it in the younger generations, but we also can see that there's just this quick and sudden recognition. And where before you were actually told in my generation that it wasn't possible to wake up in this lifetime. I guess if you, you know, did practices for 24/7 for whatever is slightly, perhaps, possible. I never believed that, but many do. And it was denser, more difficult. So the interconnected starts to come in the recognition of the body, of the human species. And that probably is the more difficult to actually see the sameness and the interconnectedness. Because we're so wired up to put it, in race and, male and female and this and that and good and bad. So the human probably is the most difficult to actually recognize and then live as if that recognition is true, which we are not separate. We cannot be separate. It's impossible for us to be separate. Each role that each culture, each race, each, time, historical time that comes up, of course, has its own role and its own purpose. It's like God coming into the costume of, now I'm going to be a male, and then I'm going to be a female, and then I'm going to be a Hindu, and then I'm going to be a Christian, and, then I'm going to be a Tibetan Buddhist, and then I'm going to on and on and on. So it's not like a mistake, but there's a certain point where all of that collapses. It actually doesn't exist in reality. And so you begin to see, even as a spiritual personality, even as someone who has genuinely have come into I am the greater wholeness rather than the separate experience. That's true, but it's often the last doorway to begin to understand and see that the other is just expressing a different aspect of the whole. And it's not separate from you. It can't be. That was the joke. For many of us, it's easier to see it in nature. We're not so comfortable with the human species, but we're more comfortable with, maybe the animal species. And so you begin to see that they too are just expressing from the same root and the same substance, and they're just contributing their uniqueness, right? We're all just contributing our uniqueness to the whole. I was given a book quite recently called Horse. Have you ever seen that? The Geraldine Brooks, she's a Pulitzer Prize winner. And then right after that, in our wonderful little free library, which I go to all the time, at the Elephant Clown, and I just picked up this book, and I can't quite even remember the name of it, Edgar something something, and it was written in the voice of a young man that couldn't speak. And so he was raised with a family that raised dogs. And the interconnectedness and the lack of any separation with himself and his companions, the dogs, was beautifully written, really exquisitely written. So we begin to enter into a relationship in the animal kingdom that, is the same as the human kingdom, but we're just now using, the common language, which is pure seeing, pure listening, pure being, and the interconnectedness. Or, the plants. Some of us are more wired up to be a little more into the interconnectedness with plants. Our brother Paul here, I always love when he goes out and, says hello to all of his garden and plants. And he knows that they're responding to his appreciation and his loving attention and his greetings to them. Sometimes that happens here. I'm letting that go deeper and deeper as possible. And then you begin to see that you also are the interconnected of the earth itself. You know, the very isness of the earth, the very essence of the earth. She too comes from the same substance. She too comes from the same root as the human and the different species and the different expressions. And then it becomes more, I don't know what the word is, infinite maybe, because you recognize that, you know, the light beings, these incredible deities that have formed and come through and have been evoked within this altar room, they too are the same. They're just occupying and expressing in a different, you know, kind of, if you want to call it, vibrational level. Both Jesus and Buddha said, what is recognized here is true for you. And I have recognized this for you. And when one in the collective recognizes itself, then it also holds that and recognizes that, and now it's possible for all beings. That's why when you start to do deep work in your family lineage, your matriarchal or your patriarchal lineage, and you start to find forgiveness by the recognition of actually what was going on, and though there was great ignorance and there was harm and there was suffering, it was impossible to be otherwise. If they could have been different, it would have been different. It's impossible for it to have been different because that's the way it was. Victimhood is a great thing to investigate. I didn't realize that I had a victimhood about how I was raised and what happened, because, you know, in most cases I just kind of walked away, you know, get it on, Sharon, because, you know, there's no one there. But when I looked deeply, there was a real deep sense of victimhood. And so I had to really look at that. And the recognition was, if I let them off the hook, if I wasn't the victim, then, you know, all that I had experienced was for naught. You know what I'm saying? There was no one to blame. And of course, there is no one to blame. And there was a very deep and fundamental unhooking with that realization. It's one of the first questions to ask you is, how is your abuse still serving you? Because it's always serving. The delusion, anyway. So when you recognize that you come up out of the generational line, which is, you know, your mother and her mother and her mother, and then your daughter and their daughter, and the patriarchal, your father, his father, their father, on, and some mysterious arising of consciousness comes up out of the unconscious lineage. The sins of the fathers go for, you know, 7 generations. And then that mysterious consciousness wakes up in you, in the lineage. And then it dives deeper until that forgiveness and clarity and understanding actually is not a fake, oh, well, they did their best. That's not true. I mean, they did, but that's an overlay, spiritual overlay. The actuality is really diving deeply into what was at play there. And in a certain kind of way, not to excuse, but a certain kind of innocence. Because it couldn't have been any other way, because that's how it was. Then it moves from the back, the grandfather, the grandmother, the on and on and on, and it moves forward into the sons and the daughters, and because it's all one thing. So you literally have been an instrument of the healing and the resolution within that family discord. That's what we're doing here. It's not something that is, this separate spiritual self that's getting something and is going to be awake and forever free of suffering. You really get it, not as a nice spiritual idealism, but the actuality is that as you are awakening, it's awakening for all beings. And if you insist upon holding on to and identifying as the suffering self, then you are holding that also in place. Now that's another thing to not feel guilty about. I don't mean that. But you hear what I'm saying? It's true. It isn't a nice spiritual idealism. It's true. And so when you realize that the sameness of the human species, of the physical bodies, of the earth as the invisible and the high spiritual realms and all of the great deities of realization and holding it and serving humanity, you are all of that. You're all of that. And so the service that just naturally arises, it isn't now I'm a good spiritual person and so I'm going to be helpful and serve other people or other ways. What awakens is it serves itself. You are that. It wasn't the ego getting it. The ego is permeated and liberated, but there never was an ego that was trying to get it or not getting it. It never existed. And so to be a good spiritual person and you want to serve, that's a beautiful impulse. You might as well do that than rather wreak havoc. But the actuality of it is it awakens and it utilizes everything that you as an individual have gathered along the way, both abuse, suffering, brilliant talent, intelligence, being an artist, the whole thing, then is used to be of service through this individuation. And there's nothing left. There's nothing else there other than the enjoyment of itself. There's nothing in there that isn't born of service. Many people go to therapists, and of course I really love therapy and what it helps and how it frees. I think especially the somatic therapy has been very, very beneficial. Here it was more on a healer's table. That's where the insights and the liberation and all of that really is still continuing. And I can tell instantly if someone is projecting their experience and their learning on me, or if they've entered in a place of open inclusiveness. And I'll never go back to that healer, not because they're wrong. It's just that I don't want someone else's viewpoint laid upon what's trying to unlock here. Though that skill and that training is very, very valuable. But the training and the skill is in service of this open, brilliant beingness. You get that? You're doing this. You hear that? You're a healer. You know when you interfere and try to make something happen, and then when you're an open pipe, an open channel, totally different. Totally different. So the more it breaks down, you know, I know here there'll just be phases, and I know it's a phase now. I didn't used to, but now I know it's a phase where people are just literally driving me crazy. I just go, I just can't stand to be in the same room. I don't know what I'm going to do. I just need to be by myself. I need another retreat. I need more of this. I need, you know, and it just is spinning and spinning and spinning. And I now know if that is really coming up, that it's a breaking up of that that delusion of separation. Do you get what I'm saying? And then the next unfolding always is, then there's a true, authentic connection to all beings in all circumstances and in all places, even though I'm drawn to some and I'm not drawn to others. And I would say it's fairly recently that I can be pretty much with what is. And I like people. I'm one of those strange people that really like people and like their stories and like to be with them. But I'm now more able to move forward and enter. Do you hear what I'm saying? And then the teaching, the wisdom can come through. And I'm either seeing a part of myself that, you know, is hidden, or I'm just, there's a great compassion in that person is doing the very best that they possibly can to what we all want, which is health and communion and love and happiness. They're just doing it in the way that best at this point serves them. So I'm not holding myself away in some kind of a holding or a position. Though, you know, I'm pretty much an open book and not much is hidden. I didn't read the teacher's book about you're not supposed to ever really be personal. Yeah, it just didn't go in. I was too naive, I think. A girl from central Kansas. I didn't have all the sophistication. So usually the human species is the last to really get the interconnectedness. And something I just, it's a book that I found here, and her name is Cynthia Neen. Does anyone know who she is? And she was a long-time student of Trungpa Rinpoche, long-time student. And she had lived in Vermont. He had a, I don't remember the name of it anymore, but a community there. And she was, I knew two people who lived there. They were friends of ours in our small community in Manhattan, Kansas, that I lived for many years. Very wonderful people. And but anyway, they lived there. And she was saying that they lived in this old beat-up farmhouse. And I've lived in several old beat-up farmhouses, no insulation, the windows, you know, they don't close, and, you know, wind whistles through. Up to 40 below. So it wasn't an easy place to live. And then to throw all these people that don't know each other in a community, and then, you know, throw Trungpa Rinpoche in it. It was pretty wild. But what I didn't understand, and what has touched me really deeply, really, really deeply, And I can't quite describe it right now because it's fairly a new recognition. And what the vision of Shambhala actually was. And, you know, from this view, the fundamental foundation is the innate goodness. You get that? We are innately good. No matter what has happened, no matter how we've explored and experimented, and the gift of the human body upon the earth is to explore and to embody and to, you know, it's like pushing around the clay. Okay, you want to know what, you know, the misuse of power is? Okay, then we're going to have a whole play of the misuse of power and the results of that. You hear what I'm saying? It's not like there's a good and a bad event here. It's like we get to see in the 3D what the misuse or the use, or, you know, what the fundamental goodness is, and then what, when you go off track and explore the fundamental separation. So the innate goodness, no matter what you have played out, is fundamentally true. And that's the foundation, the good. And I don't mean, you know, the polarity of good and bad, but the fundamental good. And no matter what is happening, no matter how it's playing it out, it's coming from the fundamental good, and it's infused by the fundamental good, and there will be resolution. It'll happen in time and space, or maybe out of time and space, but it seems like it's in time. I always say that complete recognition and the living of that is a done deal. Now it may take, you know, a few more 100 lifetimes, but it will, because it's the fundamental good. And so from this particular viewpoint, this particular teaching that she was bringing through, and supposedly Trungpa Rinpoche could look in his palm and he could actually see Shambhala and describe it. But, you know, we've all had a sense. I mean, many of us were really fascinated with Shambhala. You know, the Lost Horizon was like a movie about Shambhala. But, you know, it actually lives. They said originally it came from the Afghanistan or the Mongol or Pakistan, which I think is kind of fascinating because, you know, they've lived in such warlike, you know, chaos for so long. And supposedly, which I don't know is true, but that's what she's saying, is that the Buddha actually taught there. But it was a society that came from the foundation of what's innately good. And it expresses through each individual coming from what is innately good rather than what's wrong with me or what's lacking in me or what I'm projecting on others or what I'm projecting on myself. And what's so fascinating for me, because for many years I was really drawn to the stories of Udayana, you know, supposedly Padmasambhava and Yeshe Sogyal, and then and I have a picture of her on the altar, you know, the Kasali Devi actually comes from Udayana. And there was a vision when I sit with her in the retreat, and I don't know where it came from, but it was of the, you know, the Devi, the female representation of God, the God-filled femaleness, and she's holding a ball, and the ball is continually spinning, and it's spinning out the life force, but it's also spinning out the transformation of that particular life force. So somewhere I was connected to the Udayana and believed in it without doubt. Supposedly it was a country, and again, in that, you know, Tibetan, Nepal, you know, sort of that area. And the whole country became awake. And so because they were awake, they could see the future, and they began to see that the Mongols were coming. They said, we do not want to deal with the Mongols. So they just came into the dimension that was free of that chaos. And they service still. And they're still, you know, especially the Dakini land and different, you know, beings still, you know, are born and come forth to serve humanity or in the physical form. So Shambhala exists as well. And I've always sensed that, but I didn't have the words about it. I didn't have kind of the conscious recognition of it. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because that innate goodness, if it comes into each individual, and that is first and foremost, not what you need to do, what do you not need to do, what other people need to do to make you feel okay. And all of that is let go of. One begins to function and live from the innate goodness. And I don't know about you, but for me, when that realization came in, it was huge and it changed everything, because the belief was the opposite of that. The innate badness or not enough. And it wasn't a high idealism. It permeated this whole being. Innate goodness. And then all life, one begins to perceive all life from that innate goodness. And so this society exists, and it exists because there'll be a certain timing upon the planet. And not that we'll go into these, you know, ideal communities and everyone's groovy and perfect. It's just that now we can start to function as a community, as the interconnectedness coming from the innate goodness. And it has to happen here before it can happen in community. I know many of you have been involved with, you know, different projects and different communities, and, you know, maybe you've lived communally and maybe monasteries or ashrams. And I don't know about your experience, but my experience was, oh my God, this is one of the worst experiences I've ever had. It's like being married to people you don't even like, you know, and don't even know particularly, and you're all supposed to get along. Woo, 3 years was enough for me. But I didn't understand, you know, and everything that was in defense and held back and opinionated and felt, you know, unfair, and all of that was brought up like, you know, 1,000-fold. It was one of the most powerful times of my life, actually. I had cancer at the time, and level 4, all by myself, raising a child on my own, no family, really. And it was the most miraculous and God-guided experience I've ever had. But what I'm trying to say is that the community, it doesn't mean that you have to live in each other's house or with each other. That's fine if that's your dharma. But it's community, right? It's the greater community that you begin to live with and in, coming from and exploring together the innate goodness. Now there's lots of other teachings about Shambhala, but this has really touched me deeply. And just like these deities, they hold a certain enlightened and innately good, even though, you know, they're maybe the great transformers. They know what they're coming from, and they know their individuation, and they know how it is that they serve all beings. And all form, invisible and visible. And so to have this template in a certain kind of way that still for most of us is invisible is a template that will come forward and it will reharmonize what we as a species will begin to realize, that we are interconnected, we are all coming from the same root, the same substance, and we all have the same essential longing for joy without cause and a way to live in community that cooperates rather than destroys one another. And we're on the cusp of that right now. So which wolf do you feed?